Hi guys! In today's video, I'm going to be showing you how to make this super simple, really pretty patchwork baby blanket. So don't worry if you're a complete beginner to crochet. This is going to be an A to Z tutorial. I'm going to cover absolutely everything that you'll need to know to finish off this really nice blanket. The skills that we're going to be covering today is how to make your foundation chain. Then you're going to work your little squares using single crochet. And then I'm going to show you how to join all of those squares together using whip stitch, which is a really neat sewing technique. Finally, you're going to tidy away all of those yarn tails. I'm going to show you how to weave in those ends so that they're invisible and they're not going to unravel. Okay, so grab your yarn, grab your hook, and let's get making. So before I kick off the tutorial, why don't we first familiarise ourselves with the materials that we're going to be using today. I'm going to be working with a 6.5mm metal crochet hook, and the yarn we're going to be using is Wool & Gang's Shiny Happy Cotton yarn, and we're going to be working with 4 different colours, and for each colour you're going to need 2 balls. It's also going to be really useful to have a measuring tape and a sharp pair of scissors to hand, and once you've finished all your squares, a sewing needle will come in handy, and you'll use that to weave in any yarn tails and also join together your squares to complete your blanket. Okay, let's get started. So you're going to grab your first ball of Shiny Happy Cotton and just pull off that paper tag, and you can put it to one side, you don't need it now, and you're going to look on the inside of the ball and see if you can find your yarn end. Okay, so I've got one here, and you're going to start off by making a slip knot. So you're going to take your tail end of yarn and you're going to cross it over like so, so you've got a loop. You're going to pass the strand behind that loop, pinch onto it, pull on your 2 yarn tails, and now you should find that you've got an adjustable knot like so. So you're going to take your crochet hook and hold it in your right hand, and you're going to take that loop and slot it over the end of your hook, and you can pull on your yarn just to adjust it, and make sure it's not too tight. You want it to still be able to move quite freely on your hook. Okay, so it's a bit easier if you have your ball of yarn positioned over to your left, because what you're going to do is you're going to hold the yarn in your left hand. You're going to keep the hook in your right hand. So now that we've got our slip knot, it's time to begin working your foundation chain. And this is how you're going to start every square of your blanket, and it's how most crochet projects are started. So let's see what it looks like making your first chain stitch in your foundation chain. So you're holding the yarn in your left hand, and you're going to wrap it around your hook. Now, do it quite gently, don't pull it. If you pull it too tightly, you'll find that this sort of spins. You don't want that to happen. So just lay it gently over your hook, and now you're going to sort of pinch onto that yarn tail, slide your hook towards you, and you're going to use the end of your hook to scoop this strand of yarn through the loop that's already on your hook. So it sounds a bit confusing, but I'm going to show you really slowly. So just scoop it through, like so. So you can see that you've got your first chain stitch there. So that's one stitch that you've made in your foundation chain. So let's see that again. Take the yarn over your hook and holding on to the tail, slide your hook slowly towards you, pulling through that new strand and pushing off the old loop. So you can see now I've got 2 chains in my foundation chain. Yarn over your hook, slide the hook towards you, pulling through that new strand of yarn and letting the old loop fall off. So now I've got 3. So I'm just going to keep on repeating these steps, wrapping the yarn around my hook, and then using the end of the hook to scoop through a new strand of yarn. until I can count 16 stitches. That's how wide your square is going to be. So you need to be able to count 16 of these. So here we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. So let's do a few more until we can count 16. So I think I counted 16 there, but let's just double check to make sure that you've got enough to make your square. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. And you make sure to not count the loop on your hook. So now I've got 16 stitches, and that means that I'm ready to begin my first row of single crochet. So at the start of every row of single crochet, you're going to need to make a turning chain, and this just adds height to the start of your row. So to make a turning chain, it's exactly the same as what you've been doing to make foundation chains. So yarn around your hook and pull it through. So that's your turning chain there. So you're now going to work back across your foundation chain, working a single crochet stitch into each of these loops. So to work your first single crochet stitch, you're going to skip this stitch here and work into the second stitch from the hook. So don't count this loop on the hook, don't go into this one, go into the second one. So I'm going to take the end of my hook and I'm going to pop it in to that stitch. So once you've done that, you should be able to count 2 loops on your hook, like so. Going to take the yarn over my hook and I'm going to slide the loops towards the end, and I'm going to pull this new strand of yarn just through the first loop until it slides off, like so. So you should still be able to count 2 loops. And I'm going to complete that single crochet stitch by taking the yarn over my hook again, and you're going to bring this through both of these loops. There we go. So that is what your work should look like after you've worked 1 single crochet stitch. And now I'm going to go into my next stitch along my foundation chain and work my next single crochet stitch. So I'm going to take the end of my hook, going to pop it into that space there, take the yarn over my hook, slide the hook towards me and pull it through just that first loop. So you should still be able to count 2 loops. Yarn over your hook again and bring it through both. And you've just completed your second single crochet stitch. So you can see the steps are very simple. So I'm just going to carry on working along into each of my spaces in my foundation chain. And because you chained 16 stitches, you should then work 16 single crochet stitches into those. So we're going to go into the next stitch, yarn over your hook, pull it through that first loop, yarn over your hook, pull it through both. Put your hook into the next stitch, yarn over, pull it through, yarn over, pull it through both. So I'm just going to keep on repeating these steps until I've worked right across my chain and I've got to the end. So let's see what that looks like. I think one mistake that it's easy to make when you're new to crochet is that you pull the yarn too tight, and it's really important to stay nice and loose. That makes it easier for you to take your hook into each of the next stitches, because if the stitches are really tight, it's hard to work a new stitch into it. So just keep your work nice and loose, and it should feel nice and comfortable to work these stitches. So you can see I've almost reached the end of my foundation chain, and this is what it looks like when you've got just one stitch left to work. So let's work that last stitch. And so fingers crossed, you should be able to count 16 stitches along here. So let's see if we can count 16. So when you're counting along, each one of these sections here is a stitch. So you can see if you're looking along the top of your work, they sort of look like there's two strands, almost like V's. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. So perfect. Fingers crossed, that's what your first row of single crochet will also look like. So now that we've got to the end of that row, if you remember what I said when we started our first row, we need to do a turning chain. And remember, do this at the start of every row of single crochet. You just need it to add that little bit of extra height. If you don't do it, your square might end up looking a little bit like a triangle, and you don't want that. So take the yarn over your hook, bring it through. So that's your turning chain. And now you're going to flip your crochet over, and you're going to work back across this row of stitches. And when you work your second and all subsequent rows of single crochet, it looks a little bit different than when you're working into the foundation chain. So I'll show you what I mean. So you're going to go into the second stitch from the hook, so not this one, this one. And when you're working into your foundation chain, it looked like you were only working into one strand. Well, here you're going to go underneath two strands, but you're just going to think of them as one. So take your hook, put it into the second stitch from the hook, and you can see it looks like two strands, but just pretend that's one. Take the yarn over your hook, bring it through, take the yarn over your hook again, and bring it through both of those strands. So I'm just going to continue working along this row in the same way until I've reached the end. So let's see what that looks like. Take your hook into the next stitch, yarn over, bring it through, yarn over, bring it through both. And you might want to keep on keeping count of how many stitches you have, just to make sure that you're never getting more or less than 16. You want each row to remain at 16 stitches, and then you're going to make some really nice neat squares. So if you've matched the tension in the pattern, your square should be 12 centimeters wide and then 12 centimeters tall. Don't worry if it's a little bit either side of this, it doesn't really matter. Once you seam all the squares together, it's all going to even out. So if it's 11 or if it's 12 and a half, don't worry, it's going to be fine. But when making the squares, keep on repeating these rows of single crochet until your square is 12 centimeters tall. So when I've been making the squares, that's meant I've worked 18 rows. So you've got 16 stitches wide and then 18 rows tall. So now that I've got to the end of that row, all you're going to do is just keep on repeating those steps. Remember to make that turning chain at the start of each row until you can measure 12 centimeters and you've worked approximately 18 rows. So let's see what that looks like. Okay, so when you're getting the feeling that you might have worked enough rows for your square to measure 12 centimeters high, grab your tape measure and so you can double check to see if you're done. So when you're measuring your square, make sure that your tape measure runs parallel to the sides. So what I mean is don't have it off to an angle. This is going to distort the measurement. So you're just going to want to lay it flat, and you should be able to see you've kind of got these little bumps. These are your stitches. You wanted to sit parallel to that. So you can see my square more or less measures 12 centimeters. And as I said earlier, it really doesn't matter if it's a little bit less, a little bit more. Once you seam all of your squares together, it's going to look perfect. So I've got my 12 centimeters and I worked 18 rows to get to this point. So now I'm happy with this square and it's time to finish it off and get started on the next one. So I'm going to cut my yarn tail first, and I'm going to leave my yarn tail pretty long, and this is because I'm going to use these tails to seam the blanket together once all of the squares are knitted. So I'm actually going to leave a 50 centimeter tail. So I'm going to measure 50 centimeters. And again, this is just sort of an approximate. It's 40, 50 centimeters. It doesn't matter too much, but I'm gonna pass that yarn tail right along my measuring tape. Okay, we've hit 50. And now I'm gonna take my scissors, snip it off. Let's get rid of some of these things. Okay, and now I can pull on my hook, and I'm just gonna keep pulling until the yarn end pops through. Like so. So now you've sealed off your last stitch, and that means that you're ready to begin on your next square. And yeah, it's all finished, all perfect. So you're just going to set this to one side and then work your other squares until you've got 48 squares ready to seam together. Okay, let's fast forward to a point where you've made all 48 of your squares. And remember, if you're working with 4 colours, that means that you want to have 12 squares in each colour. So let's imagine that you've done all that. It's now time for you to seam them all together. So the way that we've positioned our squares for our blanket is that we've made it so it's 6 squares wide and 8 squares tall. And what you're going to want to do is take all of your finished squares and lay them out, making sure that this long tail is positioned at the top right-hand corner when you lay all your squares out flat. So what I mean is when you're laying all your squares out, you want to make sure that your last row of crochet is at the top. It touches the first, like the foundation chain of the square above it, and always the yarn tail positioned like so. So hopefully that makes sense. Like so. So I'm just going to start with these 2 squares here. And I'm going to thread my sewing needle with the yarn tail which is attached to the top right corner of the square in the bottom right corner of your blanket. So I've threaded my needle, and I'm going to use whip stitch to join the last row of stitches onto the foundation chain of the square above. So I'm going to take my sewing needle and I'm going to take it up through the fabric of the top square. I'm going to work up like that. So I'm going to take my needle up through that space there and pull the yarn all the way through, like so. Now I'm going to take my needle and take it down through the fabric of the bottom square in the corresponding stitch. So threaded it through. And you're going to want to pull these stitches nice and tight to create a nice secure join. So I'm now going to take my needle up through the fabric on the top square in the next space along, like so. And then I'm going to find the corresponding stitch on the bottom square, take my needle down through the fabric. And you can already see I'm creating these neat small stitches, securely joining these 2 squares together. So I'm going to find the next space on the top square, taking my yarn up through it. Then I'm going to find the corresponding stitch on the bottom square and take my needle down through there. And I'm just going to keep on repeating these steps until I've completely joined the top edge of this square to the bottom edge of this square. And as I said, make sure you pull these stitches nice and tight Firstly, so that this join is secure, but also, as I recommended cutting a 50cm tail, if you don't pull these stitches tight, you might find that you run out of yarn as you're finishing this seam, and you don't want that to happen. Okay, we're just going to secure that last stitch, and once I've gone through it once to close up that join, I'm actually going to take my needle up through that same spot again, just to make sure that the seam is really secure. So I've gone up through, and then I'm going to go down through again. So that's your first 2 squares joined. And now I'm going to take the square which is going to take this position. So I'm going to lie it down here, and again just make sure that the long tail is positioned in the top right corner. But I'm still going to keep using this yellow yarn to make the join. So I'm going to turn my work, and I'm now going to join these 2 squares together. So to start off, I'm going to take my needle, and you should be able to find this strand here, which is just attached to your tail. So I'm going to take it behind that, and then I'm going to take it through the loop, which is your last crochet stitch. So I'm going to take it up through there. Make sure that's not tangled. And so there, that's sort of the first stitch to join the 2 squares. And when you're joining the 2 side edges, it's not quite as obvious where you need to be taking your needle. So it's a good idea to just line up your squares, and as you're stitching them together, make sure that you're still lined up. So make sure that you're not finding that one square sort of going like that. You want to always make sure that they're nice and lined up and that you're joining them together equally. So I'm going to take my needle, and I'm going to find just sort of a loop on the edge of my fabric. On the bottom square, on this square, I'm going to take it down through it. And making sure to keep my squares aligned, I'm going to find a corresponding loop on the top square. So I'm just going to take my needle up through there, like so. And I'm going to take my needle down again through the yellow square. And making sure that I'm taking a loop which corresponds on the red square, I'm going to take my needle up through it. And as I said, when you were joining these 2 squares together, make sure that you're pulling your stitches nice and tight. You don't want to end up running out of yarn. So I'm taking the needle down through a bump on the edge of the yellow square, and then up through a corresponding loop of yarn. So I've gone down through the yellow square, and then I'm going to find a corresponding loop. So you're just going to keep on repeating these steps to make sure that you've equally joined your 2 squares together. Okay, and I've now reached almost the end of my 2 squares, so I'm just going to catch the last sort of edge loop. I'm going to go in here, and then I'm going to catch the edge loop on here, and I'm going to go through twice just to make sure it's doubly secure. Okay, So now I've joined these two edges using whip stitch, and you're just going to keep on repeating these steps. You're going to start with the square at the bottom right hand corner of your blanket. You're going to join a square to the top of it and a square to the side, and then you're going to gradually work through your squares, joining them together, taking the long tail, joining a square to the top, a square to the side, and so on. And you're going to repeat this until you have just one line of 6 squares left at the top of your blanket. And when you get to that point, instead of positioning your squares so that the long tail is at the top right corner, you're going to flip it so that it's at the top left. This may seem a bit odd to say now, but once you get to that point, it will make more sense because you only have these seams to join. So you need to make sure that you've got a tail position there, and then you can join those last final seams in the top line of your blanket. Okay, so the only thing left to do once you've seamed all of your squares together is sew in your yarn tails. So let's see what that looks like. So once you've finished your blanket, you're going to find that you probably have a lot of yarn tails to sew in, but don't worry, it's very easy to hide these tails, and I'm going to show you how. So you're going to want to choose which side you want to be the right side of the blanket. The nice thing about using whip stitch to join your squares is that it's pretty much reversible. It looks pretty good on both sides. So you're just going to choose which side you want to be the wrong side of the blanket, and that's the side that you're going to sew in all of your little yarn tails. So once you've made that decision, you're going to take your sewing needle and you're going to take one of your little yarn tails and you're going to thread your needle with it. And the best way to weave in a yarn tail when you're weaving it into a piece of crochet is you're going to take your needle up under a series of bumps in the fabric, first in one direction. So I've taken it under a few loops there, as you can see, and pull that tail through. And then you're going to turn your work and thread your needle in a different direction, so sort of in a zigzag. So I'm going to take my needle up here, like so. And then I'm going to turn my work again and take it in another direction. And the reason why you do it in a zigzagging motion is it means that it's a lot harder for the yarn tail to be pulled out. If you just did it in a straight line, it could get caught down here and the yarn end could get pulled out and it looks a bit untidy, or it could end up unraveling, and you don't want that. So I'm sort of threading it in a zigzagging motion. And it doesn't really matter which direction you go, just as long as it's not always a straight line. So I've worked my way up here. I'm now going to go back along here. And just as long as you've taken it in a few different sections, it's going to be nice and secure. And it's going to look really tidy. So I'm happy that that's not going to go anywhere, so you can just remove the yarn tail from your needle, and you're going to take your scissors and don't cut it right up close to the fabric, but maybe leave just like 1/2 centimetre or so, and that means that it's not going to slip out. So there you have it. That's how to weave in your yarn tail. And you can see you can't see it on the right side of the fabric. And now it's time for the grand reveal. All your hard work has paid off and you should have a beautiful finished baby blanket all ready to be used. So let's see what it looks like. So it's a really great size. So yeah, there you have it. I really hope you've enjoyed this tutorial and that you found it easy to follow, and hopefully you now all feel like complete crochet pros. So there you have it. That's how to make a patchwork crochet baby blanket.